Hello everyone. In this video, we will be dealing with recognition of prior learning. We are in particular going to consider recognition of prior learning for trainees moving from the 2016 program onto CA 2025, which is the most relevant right at this moment since we're just implementing CA 2025. Towards the end of the video, we will also talk briefly about trainees moving within the CA 2025 training program between two different training offices, which will become relevant possibly further down the line. Resources relevant for today: Template 3, Recognition of Prior Learning; Guide 5, around assessing proficiency in the professional values, attitudes, and acumen learning outcomes, together with the decision trees in Appendix 5A, 5B, and 5C, Guide 5. And possibly also Guide 3, which provides detail on the CA 2025 professional values, attitudes, and acumens in practice. A little bit more detail on the learning outcomes when you are considering recognition of prior learning. When you first set up a trainee's profile on the new electronic assessment tool, you will be able to indicate whether or not recognition of prior learning is relevant. First of all, you can select the professional development summary cycle that the trainee is coming into the program on. And secondly, you can toggle on or off whether recognition of prior learning is relevant. If you select recognition of prior learning, you will be provided with an opening professional development summary, which you will complete for that trainee. It needs to be signed off by an assessor on a line-by-line basis to indicate what proficiency level you want to reflect as an opening balance for the trainee. They will then continue to produce learning outcome reviews, and those will go into the further professional development summaries, but you'll be able to pull through any recognition for what they've already done. Let's talk a little bit about the principles of recognizing prior learning between the 2016 program and CA 2025. There is little direct correlation with the 2016 program. For that reason, there is no automatic recognition of RPL between the two programs. Unlike when we transitioned between the 2010 program and the 2016 program, where we were able to say to you, if they've got this rating, pull this one through. We can't do that entering into CA 2025. Some evidence in the PSRs may be relevant, and I'm talking here both about evidence for the professional conduct values, which has some similarity to professional values and attitudes on the CA 2025 training program, as well as the professional skills, which may also have some bearing on the learning outcomes for the acumens and for the professional values and attitudes, because it does span a much broader skill set under CA 2025. I encourage you to have a discussion with your trainees, because there also may be many things that they have demonstrated while on the 2016 program which have not been documented in a PSR. They will likely have demonstrated some of the CA 2025 acumens and some of the CA 2025 professional values and attitudes, but there's been no place to document that. Our PSRs are a lot narrower than the very broad range of professional skills which we are looking at in terms of CA 2025. So I would encourage your trainees to go back and consider anything that they've done that might be relevant for recognition of prior learning purposes. That is why we have an assessor completing a summative assessment as an opening professional development summary for those trainees. Now that we've discussed the principles of recognition of prior learning between the 2016 program and CA 2025, let's talk about what this is going to look like practically. So the first thing that you need to do is provide your trainees with the professional values, attitudes, and acumens learning outcomes. These can be found in Guide 3, which will also give them some insight into what these really mean in practice and some ideas about the examples that they might be able to provide. Ultimately, you will also prepare PVAA examples that the trainees can draw on. And if you've done that already for your training office, please give that to your trainees as well. You can also refer the trainees to Template 3 that lists all the learning outcomes that they could consider for recognition of prior learning purposes. And then the trainees need to document their evidence. So this can be done directly in the electronic assessment tool, or the EAT or EAT as we refer to it. Or you can use Template 3, and I'll talk a little bit about that now. Ultimately, the trainees will need to document their evidence in the electronic assessment tool. They can draw on what they've already documented in template 3, if that's the direction that you've taken initially, but they will need to bring that into the EAT. And at that point, the assessor will need to assess proficiency at an entry level into the program. And there you can draw on Guide 5, the decision trees. And remember that this is a summative assessment, but I'm going to talk to you about some of the nuances within the electronic assessment tool from an RPL perspective. So let's talk about the recognition of prior learning in the electronic assessment tool. As you know, in order to start a trainee on the assessment process in the electronic assessment tool, you need to load a training plan that is relevant for that particular trainee. Now, a trainee coming in from the 2016 program onto CA 2025 will need to follow a slightly different training plan from those trainees that you're bringing on directly. And that's what I'd like to show you here. In the top plan, these would be the expected levels of proficiency, an example, for trainees that might be coming on directly into CA 2025. There's likely to be quite a few learning outcomes that you're already expecting to see from the first professional development summary cycle. And you can see that there in the blue section. For trainees that are coming into the CA 2025 training program and for whom you're wanting to recognize prior learning, our suggestion is that you limit the expectations coming into the program. Every time that you indicate an expected level of proficiency during the RPL process, the trainees will be forced to document evidence, and the assessor in turn will be forced to look at those. Our suggestion is that instead you keep it open, allow the trainees to document as much evidence as they can, but don't push them towards specific learning outcomes at this stage. You can start doing that from the cycle that applies after RPL. Now, the example that we've used here is a trainee who's had a year under 2016 and is now coming on to CA 2025. So the year on the 2016 program is reflected in PDS periods 1 and 2. And then for the CA 2025 program, they will complete PDS periods 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you remember back to the beginning of this video, we showed you that you'd be able to select RPL or not, and you could also see there that I selected PDS period 3, so the RPL will be assessed for periods 1 and 2. For the example that I've got over here for a training plan for RPL purposes, the one that's in orange, this training office has indicated 1 or 2 learning outcomes where they're pretty certain that the trainee will have achieved some level of proficiency during the RPL period, and that's absolutely fine. We're just suggesting to you that you minimize that so that you're not having to go through a lot of information which may not be relevant for that particular trainee. If your trainee is behind the expected level of proficiency that you've documented for the RPL period, this will be flagged for development. Anywhere that you haven't indicated an expected level of proficiency during the RPL period, obviously that's not going to be picked up for development. I'll show you a little bit more about that shortly. So what is it going to look like when a trainee comes into the electronic assessment tool environment and wants to document evidence? If you indicate that you want to recognize prior learning, the trainee will be presented with a professional development summary specifically for RPL purposes. This is not the same as the professional development summary that you use throughout the assessment process. This PDS has a very particular purpose, and that is to allow the trainee to document evidence that came before they came into CA 2025. Here is an example of how the trainee would document evidence for one of the professional values or attitudes. You can see down here that in terms of the trainee reflection, the trainee is prompted to provide evidence of a certain quality: who, what, where, when, and how, and to reflect on the level of complexity of the situations encountered. So what we're suggesting here is that trainees need to start thinking about how they're actually going to be assessed on this evidence. And the prompts are around the dimensions that the evaluator and the assessor are going to take into account when they are assessing proficiency. For this particular learning outcome, the evaluator determined that the trainee was not yet at the level that was required as documented for the RPL period. And that's why development needs are reflected for this particular PDS. And you'll see that they're flagged there. And there's also a place for the evaluator to indicate what kind of development might be required towards the development plan. Now let's take a moment to look at the documentation of evidence for the acumens. So this is slightly different from the professional values and attitudes. You can see here that the prompt is different for a trainee because the dimensions under which they are measured for the acumens differ from the dimensions used to measure proficiency in the professional values and attitudes. So here the trainee is prompted to provide evidence of how they demonstrated this learning outcome, who, what, where, when, and how, and to reflect on guidance required, integration of knowledge sources and skills. That could be other acumens, it could be a variety of technical knowledge skills, it could be professional values and attitudes that they've integrated here. Whether they required analysis and evaluation and needed to present recommendations, and whether they took responsibility for their own work and the work of others. When the evaluator and the assessor come to use the decision trees to determine the level of proficiency for this particular learning outcome, this information will be very important for them. And then the last sentence there that I'd like to highlight is that if trainees want to present multiple examples, they should number them within this block. There is only one place for reflection for each learning outcome. There are not multiple fields available for different elements of evidence. The same applies for the professional values and attitudes. So why have we given you template 3? So template 3 is for your trainees to use before you come onto the electronic assessment tool. It is not an importable template. It is simply so that you can get your trainees into the habit of presenting evidence, and perhaps for training purposes, or to use in this interim period until you're ready to bring them onto the electronic assessment tool. You will notice that we have included similar fields to those that are incorporated in a learning outcome review. So for example, here you can see that this is the same prompt of evidence that appeared in the electronic assessment tool. And the same thing for the acumens prompt. The last thing that I would like to mention about recognition of prior learning in the electronic assessment tool is that you will see that the decision tree that is used for the professional values and attitudes is the same decision tree as you will see in other professional development summaries. For the acumens, however, because there are two decision trees and the two mesh together, we have elected to use the Learning Outcome Review decision tree for the assessment of evidence that a trainee documents during the period of recognition of prior learning. You can keep the RPL professional development summary open, and your trainees can keep providing evidence on the new period under CA 2025 in learning outcome reviews, provided that they close off the learning outcome reviews and that RPL PDS before they open up the new professional development summary for the period now under CA 2025. Okay, so I promised that I would also talk about what happens when trainees move between offices on the CA 2025 training program. The first thing that we focused in the electronic assessment tool is making sure that where you bring trainees from the 2016 program onto CA 2025, that the RPL process makes sense for those trainees. When it comes to trainees moving between offices on CA 2025, the intention is to allow automatic processing of opening ratings, that an assessor can then go in and say, yes, we're willing to accept this one. No, we're not willing to accept this one. As a training office, your policy will also guide you here. If your method of recognizing prior learning is simply to assess the trainee on your training program and then reflect backwards and forwards to determine how much time the trainee still needs and how much you can recognize from a prior learning perspective, you're still able to do that. If, however, you prefer to use an opening balance from a previous office and then confirm whether the trainee really is at that level over a period of time, the tool will also assist you to do that. Similarly to the 2016 into CA 2025, we foresee that the RPL PDS will be able to stay open for a period of time while the trainee continues to provide evidence on learning outcome reviews as they come into their new training office, and that can all get wrapped up and then put into the next PDS. So you can choose whether you want to use the RPL function in the electronic assessment tool or not when you bring the trainee into your training program. Remember that RPL in the electronic assessment tool is about assessing towards recognition of prior learning. It is not the process in TCMS where you actually indicate how many months RPL you're willing to recognize. For the 2016 program coming into CA 2025, there is nothing to do on TCMS from an RPL perspective. This is simply for assessment purposes to give your trainees recognition for what they've already done on the 2016 training program that might be relevant for CA 2025. Thank you for your attention. Please remember that you can contact us if you have any questions.